BC. So you have people reading it later on. But the writings from Daniel come out of this period of captivity for the people of Judah. And within the book, you kind of have one of the earliest examples of apocalyptic literature. And so we're not going to talk about some of that today, but if you ever want to do a fun little deep dive into some interesting stuff, I highly recommend Daniel 7. It's an interesting read. Daniel has a pretty wild dream. So you have this genre of apocalypse, but what it's doing is it's making visible the hidden workings of both what the empire is doing that may not be like on the surface, but also the workings of what God is doing in the midst and in spite of the workings of the empire. And so specifically, Daniel is like a historical apocalypse. And so it's interpreting the events and circumstances of both the past, present, and future to help God's people kind of claim their history and identity, even in the midst of this unspeakable trauma that's happening within the Babylonian captivity. And so an interesting thing about Daniel, so it's written in both Hebrew and Aramaic. So it starts out in Hebrew. So the first part of the first passage we'll read is in Hebrew, and then there's a shift to it going into Aramaic. And then also the last we'll close the Daniel, the Lion's Den, and that's also written in Aramaic. And it's kind of this really artistic and eloquent thing that the book is set up like this, because the language depicts what's happening in the story, the language that's used to write the story. So you have the language of the empire, Aramaic, couched between the sacred language of the people of God, so Hebrew, and so it's a way to have this sacredness in the midst of the empire, and that's kind of what the story of Daniel is, right? The people of God still trying to follow God and be faithful to God, even in the midst of this persecution. And so that's just kind of like an interesting fun fact about the book. So the two stories that they're kind of three stories, but the two main passages that we're going to look at today all take place in the first half of Daniel. And so the stories in the first 6 chapters of Daniel are kind of like these hero chronicles of Daniel and his friends. So the friends are commonly known as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But their Hebrew names are Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael. And so we'll see them be given new names in the first chapter of Daniel, which we're going to look at in a second. And so it's kind of these hero stories that we get of these 4 friends. You probably are familiar with the 3 in the fiery furnace. And so I know if your kids ever grew up watching VeggieTales, there's that episode where there's like a chocolate bunny, and they go into, and all these years later, I still think about that whenever I hear that story. I can even hear like the song they were supposed to sing to this giant chocolate bunny. So it's a little rabbit hole I just went down. But anyway, so that's the section we're kind of looking at today. We're kind of, our stories are all coming out of these kind of collection of stories of these four Hebrew men. And within these 6 chapters, they find themselves in favor of the court. And so they kind of gain the king's favor. And they go through 3 different kings, Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, 4 different kings, Darius, and then Cyrus. And so they gain favor with all of these kings, and kind of rise to a high court position within the court of each king. And so these kind of hero court tales provide the basis for the latter half of the book of Daniel, chapters 7 through 12, which gets a bit more apocalyptic. And so anyway, So a large part of this, of the book of Daniel, obviously, is how do the people of God survive in the midst of all of this persecution. But it's also Daniel kind of receiving wisdom to interpret dreams, and not just his own dreams, but the dreams of the king, which is partially how he gains this favor. So we're going to start off with Daniel chapter 1. And I broke up the first section that I'm going to teach because it's so lengthy. So I will, I guess I'll read it just for the sake of time, and we'll do our best to get through all of the stories, which I feel like I'm always trying to do my best with y'all to get through all the stories, but we'll get through what we get through. So Daniel chapter 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of King Jehoiakim of Judah, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came to Jerusalem and besieged it. The Lord let King Jehoiakim of Judah fall into his power, as well as some of the vessels of the house of God. These he brought to the land of Shinar and placed the vessels in the treasury of his gods. Then the king commanded his palace master Ashpenaz to bring some of the Israelites of the royal family and of the nobility, young men without physical defect and handsome, versed in every branch of wisdom, endowed with knowledge and insight, and competent to serve in the king's palace. They were to be taught the literature and language of the Chaldeans. The king assigned them a daily portion of the royal rations of food and wine. They were to be educated for 3 years, so that at the end of that time they could be stationed in the king's court. Among them were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah from the tribe of Judah. The palace master gave them other names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar, Hananiah he called Shadrach, Mishael he called Meshach, and Azariah he called Abednego. But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the royal rations of food and wine. So he asked the palace master to allow him not to defile himself. Now God allowed Daniel to receive favor and compassion from the palace master. The palace master said to Daniel, "I am afraid of my lord the king. He has appointed your food and your drink. If he should see you in poorer condition than the other young men of your own age, you would endanger my head with the king." Then Daniel asked the guard whom the palace master had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, "Please test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. You can then compare our appearance with the appearance of the young men who eat the royal rations, and deal with your servants according to what you observe." So he agreed to this proposal and tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, it was observed that they appeared better and fatter than all the young men who had been eating the royal rations. So the guard continued to withdraw their royal rations and the wine they were to drink, and gave them vegetables. To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and skill in every aspect of literature and wisdom. Daniel also had insight into all visions and dreams. At the end of the time that the king had set for them to be brought in, the palace master brought them into the presence of Nebuchadnezzar, and the king spoke with them. And among them all, no one was found to compare with Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore, they were stationed in the king's court. In every matter of wisdom and understanding concerning which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in this whole kingdom. And Daniel continued there until the 1st year of King Cyrus. So typically I would ask y'all if you have any thoughts or what did you hear reactions. And if you have a burning thought, please let me know. But for the sake of time, I think we can I'll just kind of give some thoughts on it, unless anyone has any thoughts that they would like to share. So kind of what we see here, so especially for the readers of this book in 2nd century Jerusalem, Judea, which is at that point they'd fallen under the control of the Roman Empire. So they're still kind of living in this period of state domination and empire and religious persecution. And so kind of what this story is inviting them into is their own experience as colonial subjects under Roman rule. And so when, obviously foreign rule creates this set of competing demands and loyalties for them, And so kind of some of the questions they're beginning to ask is it possible to remain faithful to God while serving the empire? Would God equip the faithful with wisdom and strength to speak to both the ruled and the ruler, to speak like words of truth that would lead to righteousness in life? And so these are some of the questions that the people reading Daniel are asking. And so we'll kind of see these questions answered in a sense, all within this first chapter. So Daniel and his friends are given new names in Aramaic. It's not their language; it's the language of their captors. And then they're trained in the literature and the lore of a foreign culture, which, you know, this culture prides itself on like reading the stars and dreams, and it's a very kind of mystical, magical culture. And so they do all of those things. They're learning about this new culture and all of that. But when it comes time to eat the food that they're given, that's kind of where they draw the line, which I think on the surface seems kind of an interesting place to draw the line. But, you know, this offering of food to them, it's an act of patronage that would then demand their allegiance. And that's what would claim the power to sustain their human life. And so by drawing the line at not accepting the food that the king wants to give them and just having water and vegetables, it's going to show that my allegiance is not going to go to the empire. Instead, it's going to go to God, because God will continue to sustain us with the food of the earth. And which is exactly what happens, right? And so because of this, they're given all of this knowledge and wisdom, far more than their captors. And that's kind of where we begin to see them get these high places in the court, because they have this knowledge and wisdom to interpret the dreams and to do all of these things that gives them a high position. And so, so that's kind of where our four heroes are at right now. So they're having, you know, so the people reading this are seeing these four men having courage and faith in the face of all of this persecution and all of this, you know, in spite of being trained in this foreign culture and religion and language. So I'm going to move us to chapter 2, which really, the part we're not going to read concerns what actually happens in Nebuchadnezzar's dream, which there's like a big stone statue that's made of different metals and clay, and the statue is broken by a stone and becomes like chaff in the wind, which has like all these layers of meaning that Daniel unpacks later in chapter 2, which we're not going to read. But this is where we see the shift to Aramaic. The book begins, the book is then written and read in Aramaic, beginning in verse 4 in chapter 2. And it actually says it, and it's kind of funny. At least I think it's funny. And so you see this shift because the divinators and dream interpreters begin talking, and that's kind of when you see the book begin take that shift to Aramaic, because so much of it is these court stories now. So I'll read chapter 2 through verse 19. In the second year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, Nebuchadnezzar dreamed such dreams that his spirit was troubled and his sleep left him. So the king commanded that the magicians, the enchanters, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans be summoned to tell the king his dreams. When they came in and stood before the king, he said to them, I have had such a dream that my spirit is troubled by the desire to understand it. The Chaldeans said to the king in Aramaic, O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will reveal the interpretation. The king answered the Chaldeans, "This is a public decree. If you do not tell me both the dream and its interpretation, you shall be torn limb from limb, and your houses shall be laid in ruins. But if you do tell me the dream and its interpretation, you shall receive from me gifts and rewards and great honor. Therefore, tell me the dream and its interpretation." They answered a second time, "Let the king first tell his servants the dream. Then we can give its interpretation." The king answered, "I know with certainty that you are trying to gain time, because you see I have firmly decreed. If you do not tell me the dream, there is but one verdict for you. You have agreed to speak lying and misleading words to me until things take a turn. Therefore, tell me the dream, and I shall know that you can give me its interpretation." The Chaldeans answered the king, "There is no one on earth who can reveal what the king demands. In fact, no king, however great and powerful, has ever asked such a thing of any magician or enchanter or Chaldean. The thing that the king is asking is too difficult, and no one can reveal it to the king except the gods, whose dwelling is not with mortals." Because of this, the king flew into a violent rage and commanded that all the wise men of Babylon be destroyed. The decree was issued, and the wise men were about to be executed, and they looked for Daniel and his companions to execute them. Then Daniel responded with prudence and discretion to Arioch, the king's chief executioner, who had gone out to execute the wise men of Babylon. He asked Arioch, the royal official, "Why is the decree of the king so urgent?" Arioch then explained the matter to Daniel. So Daniel went in and requested that the king give him time, and he would tell the king the interpretation. Then Daniel went to his home and informed his companions, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, and told them to seek mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that Daniel and his companions with the rest of the wise men of Babylon might not perish. Then the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision of the night, and Daniel blessed the God of heaven. So, long story short, none of the magicians and interpreters can tell and interpret the dream, but Daniel can. And so it's kind of this funny exchange between the magicians and the king, because they're trying to get him to tell them the dream, because for Babylonians, visions of the night or dreams were believed to convey messages from their gods. So the dream interpreters wanted to know first what the dream was, so they would know if it was favorable or unfavorable before they give this verdict, essentially because they don't want to tell the king that it's a bad outcome, right? And they want to find a way to like kind of spin it. So, but because they can't tell him what the dream is, he sentences all the wise men, interpreters, whatever you want to call them, to death, except Daniel gets wind of this and is like, "No, I can do it. Just give me some time." And that's when we see that Daniel and his friends begin to pray for this knowledge and wisdom of interpretation, and their prayer is answered, and they're able to tell Nebuchadnezzar what the dream means, thus saving their own lives. But I think it's also an important note that they also want to save the lives of the Babylonians, who are the people that are persecuting them and keeping them captive, which is a really interesting thing, that they're concerned with their lives as well. And so they're concerned with saving human life, and not just selfishly saving their own lives. Yeah. Okay. So I'm gonna move us to Daniel in the lion's den. Sorry I'm moving so quickly, everyone. And I think so. I feel like Daniel in the lion's den is probably, well, it definitely is the most well-known story in the book of Daniel, but I would also say it's probably one of the most well-known stories in the whole Bible, because if you grew up in Sunday school, or going to VBS or church camp, or even if you've just like been to church 4 times, you've probably heard the story of Daniel in the lion's den. And so it's a story that everyone knows by heart. And so what we see is, Daniel, over the course of these 5 chapters beforehand, has gained such favor with the kings that he keeps getting moved to higher positions in the court. And so it's kind of created, he's in this high rank, and repeatedly performing his fellow courtiers. And the success kind of inspires jealousy and conspiracy among them, which is a pretty well-known trope in Jewish and Mesopotamian literature. So in both of these cultures, both Jewish culture and the Babylonian culture, this is like jealousy and conspiracy is a well-known trope. But even in the midst of this, Daniel gets unfairly thrown to the lion's den. And so what we see here is Daniel continues to remain faithful to God, even in the face of death. And God continues to remain faithful to Daniel, which is really beautiful. And so, which is kind of the most common interpretation I think we've heard of this story. But what I kind of want to leave you with, maybe a different way of looking at Daniel in the lion's den. Because I think, especially with stories like this that we know so well, it's important to sometimes try to find a different angle to look at them, so that they can reveal new things to us. Because even the stories we know by heart, they can still reveal new things to us and help us to look at things in new ways. So this is just something I'll leave you with to just think about and chew on. So while Daniel in the Lion's Den is very much a story about Daniel's faithfulness to God and God's faithfulness to Daniel, it's also a story about what an oppressive and corrupt justice system looks like. And so this system is geared toward imprisoning, abusing, and torturing a certain type of people, right? So Daniel, even though he'd gained this high favor, he's still always going to be, a foreigner. He's not a free man, right? He's a captive. And so he's different ethnicity, religious minority, all of these things. And so this justice system is geared toward his type of people, the type of people that don't fall in line with, whatever the empire wants. And so I think this story, as readers today, can help us look at our own corrupt systems, whether that be our justice system or other systems of oppression and persecution that we have, and can help us look at that and analyze it a bit. And so when we're looking at our own corrupt systems, Daniel, the book of Daniel, specifically the story in Daniel, can help us to perceive that systemic abuse, and also reclaim the power to reform and transform these oppressive systems. And so I think that's just maybe a new way to look at the story, and maybe look at that in comparison to corrupt systems that we have in our world today. But yes, overall though, the story of Daniel, even though there is so much, there's a lot of scary stuff in Daniel because of the Babylonian captivity and the persecution that they're living under, but it's still a story of God remaining faithful to God's people. Sorry, there's a gnat flying around. And God remaining faithful and God taking care of God's people, which is always encouraging and hopeful for us. And I only went a couple minutes over my 9:40 time. So
you did great. Thank you so much, Leigh.
It was fun to be
very much. Let me ask you this. I understand that this was the origin or the birth of synagogues during this time, because they could not worship in the temple, so they had places they could worship away from Jerusalem. So that came out of this experience as well, as I understand. Is that correct?
I don't know. I think they had to be really discreet in how they worshiped during this time. And obviously before this, with different, through their wilderness wanderings and stuff, they have like this sacred tent that represents the presence of God. And so a big thing, through their captivities. So when Jerusalem is taken over with the siege of Jerusalem, that's kind of, the temple is destroyed. And so it's kind of this time period where they don't have a place of worship. And so once they come out of this, they're able to rebuild. So places of worship were a thing before the captivity, as well as mobile places of worship, I guess, because they carried the ark in a tent, or in a tent. And so but yeah.
Okay. Okay. Thank you so much, Leigh. Does anyone else have any comments they want to make? If you want to unmute yourself, otherwise, if there's none, we'll move to Vicki. And thank you so much, Leigh, for doing this. We'll look forward to you next week as well. Then Vicki, why don't you go ahead and lead us in prayer?
Okay, pray with me, please. Our most gracious Heavenly Father and loving God, we worship you today together. I'm so thankful that we have this method that we can use to see each other's faces and hear each other's voices. And we're so anxious to be back together, but we want to do that safely. So help us to use wisdom in that. We just thank you for every blessing that you give us, and the fact that many of us have remained healthy, and even most of our family members, if you look at percentages, we've really stayed healthy, and mostly because we're really careful, and you've granted that to us. So I thank you for that. Lord, we have lots of things that we want to ask of you today, and we just pray that you will grant these prayer requests, because they're really important to us as individuals and as a group, as a church, as a city, and a nation, that you would protect the healthcare workers from this deadly virus. And I just pray you bless their lives for the sacrifices that they're making right now, being away from their families, and working long hours to get done what needs to be done, the care that they need to give. I just pray that you would be with the decisions of individuals and businesses and churches as we try to open things up and get back together. But Lord, give us wisdom in that, because we don't want to do that too soon, and we don't want to do it too many people at one time. We don't want crowds. We know that we've been taught now what is safe and what's unsafe. So I just pray that you help everybody to realize that it's really not worth the risk, and just help us to, for those of us who can, just stay home and just give it more time. But be with our pastor and leaders in our church as they try to be a little more careful than some, and protect us from what is out there, and protect us from each other. I pray too, Lord, that you'll be with our high school and college graduates. This is such a different, strange year for them to end the last 9 weeks the way they had to do that. And I think school districts are coming up with really creative ideas so the kids can be, their accomplishments can be acknowledged. And I just pray that you would bless them, that they'd be patient, and they would be accepting of this new way this year. But I pray that you would help them, like Diana's nephew, to figure out what they want to do and be able to make those decisions that are really important, because they're running out of time. I pray that you be this blood drive, not just this, but all over the county and the country, where blood is scarce and where it's needed. And I pray that you would just put it on people's hearts, that they would, be willing to give if they're able at all to do that, because it's such a critical thing. If you're the one that needs the blood, that it's not there for you. So I just pray that will happen. And thank you for Linda's promotion of that, to get that done. I pray that you will be with Laura Wednesday with her foot surgery, that she would help that to be successful and keep her safe during and after the surgery. I pray that you be with Jerry in the grief of her friend Karen's death. That's so shocking. I lost a friend this week, and I know how tragic that is, and just kind of unbelievable. So I pray that you would be with Jerry and be with Karen's family. Be with Deborah in the loss of her friend, and be with Faye, dealing with her mother and her heart issues and procedures coming up, and be with Fred Harrell's family in his death, and comfort them, Lord, as only you can do. I just pray that those in our group, especially in our church that have lost jobs, and so many others that we know of that have they've been displaced or put on furlough, and I pray that those kinds of things will open back up to them, and they will be able to go back to work and provide for their families, and not have the fear and the anxiety of not being able to put food on the table or get the medications they need. And Lord, I know you didn't cause the virus, but I know that you're in control of everything, and I know that, you know, you can slow this down, and we thank you for that in the county, Lord, that this has peaked and leveled off and a little, and we're having fewer cases even today, and I just thank you for that. Protect us, please. Keep us safe. Help us not to be lonely, and not to be ungrateful for what we do have and the time we have. And just pray that you'll help us to reach out, even by phone, if that's all we can do, to just comfort people like Jerry was comforted this week. Help us to be there for each other. And the 5 on Friday that George has promoted, just help us to know that that's another group of people, or special people that we can reach out to that really need a touch from a friend, and need to lend a shoulder or listening ear. So I thank you for these people who are reaching out, and those who are being reached that know that they needed that day. Thank you again for all your many blessings. Thank you for Laura and Dennis, and for guiding us and taking care of people, and taking care of needs behind the scene that we probably have no idea about. Thank you for Wilshire, and thank you for his special friends. And thank you mostly, Lord, for Jesus. In your name I pray. Amen.
Thank you very much. It's great to see everyone.